I'm Roland Angle with Families for the Ethical Psychiatric Treatment of Patients and Prisoners, and today is May 19th, 2013, and we're here in San Francisco at the American Psychiatric Association Convention, and we've been very fortunate to encounter Jim Gottstien, who is the founder of Psych and has made great contributions in the field of legal jurisprudence in the field of mental health, including some judgments that have been handed down in the state of Alaska against forced drugging. Is that correct?
Thanks, Roland. Yeah, yes. I don't know about great contributions, but yes, I've won 4 Alaska Supreme Court decisions.
Right. Well, believe me, there are many people in the field who are dealing with problems in psychiatry who look to your contributions as great contributions. I'm one of them.
That's nice.
And I have some questions for you in reading about some of the things that you've done and pertains to the law.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if you have a position that there's absolutely no place at all for forced drugging in the psychiatric treatment of people that have incarcerated for a crime or a suspicion of a crime or things like that?
Well, in the law there are different justifications, legal justifications for drugging someone against their will. And so you really have to look at what those are. And the short answer is I don't think people should be drugged against their will. It was interesting, I had a meeting with there was a meeting of the Radical Psychiatry Caucus last night, and they were talking about, well, what about, someone who's has dementia, and creating a big ruckus and all that. And my position was, well, does that really justify giving them brain-damaging chemicals that will shorten their life in 2? And they basically said, well, maybe yes, it is, justified. So I don't really think it is. I think you can, that's kind of the extreme example.
Uh-huh.
And what happens is that even if you could make a case, which I wouldn't necessarily make in that example, what happens is that type of example is used to drug all kinds of people for all kinds of reasons. And so one of the reasons to drug people under the law is to make the person competent to stand trial. Okay. Well, in the Jared Loughner case, that they won a while on resisting that and then finally lost. And you had this report that said, oh, see how well it worked? Before he was very disruptive in the courtroom, and now there was a 7-hour hearing and he basically sat still and didn't do anything. Well, it's not an example of making someone competent. It's just that they suppressed him so much that he wasn't causing trouble, and that's basically what these drugs do. And so one of the fundamental legal principles for drugging someone against their will is what's called under the police power justification, which is a public safety. If a situation is so dangerous that you have to drug someone to...
Let's hurry up.
So in the police power, the idea is that they need to drug someone for public safety. And so, for example, in Alaska, they'd say you can do that in a hospital, emergency medication, if serious illness or death is highly probable.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so, well, just in terms of a legal standard, that maybe seems reasonable from a legal standard. But in reality, they'll drug people for yelling. They say agitation. I did a deposition of a psychiatrist who had no idea that was the standard and had no idea what the order that she wrote meant.
Right.
So the other justification is under what's called the parens patriae, which is that it's in someone's best interest.
Right.
And that's in the civil context. Well, you can't really prove, and you have to prove that by clear and convincing evidence. You can't really prove legitimately that these drugs are in someone's best interest and that there's no less intrusive alternative. So it's really a corrupt system. And then I was talking about the Jared Loughner situation. The standard for making someone competent to be competent to stand trial is that the person is able to understand the charges against them and assist their lawyer. Okay. Well, the drugs don't really help anybody do that. So it's all really, they're all really sham proceedings and pretenses.
Pretextuality?
Yeah. To use, are you familiar with Michael Perlin?
Yes.
Yeah, pretextuality. Yeah.
Right.
Pretext. Yes.
Right. Pretext. So, do you believe that this system is headed towards more of this expansion of these kinds of? Well, let's go back.
But let me say this: is that the
Turn that down a little bit, please, or go somewhere
he's
else.
doing that on purpose.
Yeah.
Trying to be a jerk? That's not part of your job, right?
So I think this witch hunt arising out of the Sandy Hook massacre is very scary, and basically, we don't even know what Adam Lanza, his situation is, because the public has, the public authorities have suppressed release of the information. There's some suspicion that it may have been caused by psychiatric drugs. We don't know, but that's a possibility. But in any event, the reality is that people diagnosed with mental illness have a very minuscule contribution to the gun violence in this country, and it is totally irrational to be focusing on people diagnosed with mental illness. But that's been the only thing that everybody can agree on is, oh, let's target people that have been diagnosed with mental illness. And to me, this is the scariest time that I've ever seen, because I think we've got this juggernaut of oppression coming.
Headed our way.
Yeah.
Let me ask you this: do you think that psychiatrists have any status or deserve status as experts in the court of law?
No.
Why not?
Well, because they have no real science behind what they testify to. I mean, basically it's lies. And the only way they get away with it is because there's no one to resist it. The lawyers that are appointed to defend people don't really do that. They just basically show up so that the box can be checked that the person had a lawyer, as they're entitled to.
Do you know of any lawyers that have challenged the legal status of psychiatrists in court?
Well, as experts?
Yes. Is there anybody that's said you can't testify because you're not an expert, you're not scientific?
I tried it once. I didn't really get it.
The judge didn't buy into it?
Well, actually, I had a psychiatrist who was limited. He couldn't testify about the science. He could only testify about his clinical experience.
I see. Well, let's continue this. We just got run off by the security at Buena Vista here, but we'll see if we can get through with this without another interruption from the police state. I wonder how fruitful, from a legal standpoint, it would be for lawyers to routinely challenge the legal status of psychiatrists as experts.
Well, I think that it's something that should be done regularly, but it's just not. And as I said, the lawyers assigned to represent people really don't do so very vigorously. I mean, the courts have held that people have the right to a lawyer, so they get to check that box off. And they're not really allowed to get people off. They work for the state, and the state is trying to lock people up and drug them. And so it's really just as I said, a pretext. And well, it's just a pretend representation. In fact, there's the term public pretenders instead of public defenders, and I think that's a pretty accurate description most of the time. So there are so many legal ways to challenge what's going on, but it's just not being done. My estimate is that no more than 10% of the people that get locked up, involuntary commitment, which is really psychiatric imprisonment, no more than 10% actually meet the legal commitment criteria. And you could argue even then of whether it should be done. But just in terms of the legal criteria, I don't think more than 10% do. In terms of forced drugging or electroshock, I don't think anybody can ever satisfy the legal requirements for that. Now, I know people that find the drugs helpful, and I think they should have access to them. I think they should tell the truth about them, including that there are other options that a lot of people find helpful without the harm. But if people want to take the drugs, that's fine with me. And some people, really, as I said, find them quite helpful. But to take that around and then force someone who's telling you that they don't work, that they make me feel terrible, I'd rather be the other way, that's really abhorrent to then force someone. And as I said in my talk, the United Nations has pretty formally stated that forced drugging can constitute torture. I mean, we used to point at the Soviet Union and say they were giving psychiatric drugs to political dissidents, and we really should look in the mirror.
Do you think that, in fact, these drugs and these methods of charging someone with being mental illness have political overtones in the U.S. today?
Well, I think, it's like this, David Oakes, the revered leader who had of Mind Freedom, who, had this tragic accident, has talked about Martin Luther King saying, that we should be creatively maladjusted, and the idea that people should be satisfied, with this world we have where we're, dumping 90 million tons of pollutants into the air every day. We're causing, and causing global warming. We've got 40%, I forget, but, this ungodly number of children, in poverty, and adults in poverty, and hunger in this country, and and why should people really be happy with that, adjusted to that? And so when people, basically don't accept the status quo and don't accept fitting into what society expects of them, then that's when psychiatry intervenes a lot. And so I don't know if they would call that political overtones or not, but I think it's an indication that society has gotten increasingly intolerant of any kind of behavior outside of a very narrow set of norms, basically.
So you would see that the boundaries of acceptable social behavior are continually being constricted, and that could be related to the increasing use of psychiatric drugs?
Yeah, and really the psychiatric labeling, diagnosing. I mean, it starts with the diagnosing, and then that justifies the drugs or locking someone up. Yeah, so they say, if you're not, if you don't want to go get a job and, conform with society, then you're mentally ill. But I'm not saying that people don't go crazy. I think people do go crazy for all kinds of reasons. And then the question is, then what do you do about that? And what the science shows is that what we're doing, what psychiatry is doing, is making things far worse. That the drugs prevent people from getting better. The electroshock is devastating to many people. And of course, the drugs are killing people. A lot of people.
Some people have characterized this trend as a revolt against science. What do you think about
what trend?
That? The trend towards increasingly medicating people that do not conform to social norms that are increasingly restrictive, and denying evidence that would indicate that perhaps a different course of action might be more desirable. as part of a general trend to denial of science.
Oh, well, I don't know. I think that's kind of a separate issue. I think that kind of psychiatry is in denial. I mean, or it's it's delusional. But I think its belief system is truly delusional. There's a great quote in Gail Hornstein's book, Agnes's Jacket, which is kind of a description of personal accounts of madness over the centuries, really. And she quotes this guy from, I don't know, the 1850s in England. He says, they said I was mad, and I said I wasn't, and by God, they outvoted me.
Right.
And so that's kind of where we're at, is that society has given over this authority to psychiatrists, and they're really just witch doctors, you know.
So you would characterize this alliance.
I don't mean to insult
Right,
witch
yeah.
doctors, actually.
Okay, so you would you characterize the agreement between the court system and psychiatry to appoint psychiatrists as experts in this field as sort of a marriage of convenience to deal with troublesome persons?
Yeah, I think that's fair characterization. I mean, on our website we have this little link that says psychiatry, force of law, and there's a quote from Michael Perlin, Professor Perlin, where he just talks about how testimonial dishonesty, he calls it, is just regularly accepted, and the whole system knows that it's not really a legitimate legal process.
Right, and everybody's on board with it. The court, the district attorney, the public defender, everybody but the defendant.
Right. And then I will say that there was this case in New York that Kim Darrow did, who passed away a couple of years ago, but he had electroshock. He had a patient who was being electroshocked, and he was one of the few, what they're called mental hygiene legal services in New York, one of the few of those lawyers that really tried, to vindicate his client's rights. And the judge wouldn't let him put on his case. He says, "Oh, I know about electroshock. I won't even let you cross-examine the doctor." And that was bad enough. And then the Court of Appeals, it's whatever they're called there, upheld that. And it was really outrageous because it's a explicit court decision that says we're not going to give psychiatric respondents real legal rights in court.
Well, I think in California here, the are you familiar with mentally disordered offender legislation?
Not really. It's like sexual predators, and then I don't know about the mentally ill defender.
Yeah, the mentally
offenders.
disordered offender laws were actually passed before the sexually violent predator laws were passed, and they were the foundation that the sexually violent predator laws were based on. And of course, the SVP laws are even more draconian than the MDO laws.
Right.
But the MDO laws are typically placed in the penal code and designated as a civil piece of legislation, so that the defendant is deprived of the rights that he has under criminal law in his defense against the state. And this duality in the law as to whether it's civil or criminal is played back and forth in many aspects to the detriment of the defendant.
Right. Well, I don't really know the specifics, and I'm curious whether or not there's ever been a serious challenge of that raised on due process grounds, because it sounds, pretty questionable on due process grounds. I've got a case in Alaska right now where I'm arguing that is what's called an ex parte proceeding. In this particular circumstance, ex parte meaning the defendant or respondent doesn't even get notified that of the proceeding, and therefore doesn't have a chance to even have his or her say, and that's just a fundamental pillar of due process, procedural due process. And so I've got a case going up there right now, but that law's been on the books since probably 1986 or so, and it's never been challenged. So I wonder if a serious legal challenge has ever been raised to this in California.
Well, there was a legal challenge raised when it was first passed because it didn't contain a dangerous clause. And so the argument was that the proceedings under the mentally disordered offender law were more onerous than they were under civil commitment law, because you didn't have to prove dangerousness.
Yeah.
And so they threw the law out, and
Yeah.
they put the dangerous clause in
Mhm.
and put it back, and it has stood up since then. And I don't know.
What do you mean stood up being in spite of challenges?
In spite of challenges, right. And
Well,
I don't know how serious those challenges have been, because as you point out, most of the defendants are represented by public defenders, and there's been a number of challenges on a number of different levels, but none of them have succeeded in challenging the law.
yeah. Well, I'd have to look at the specifics to figure out what's going on there. And people are raised in a certain culture, and they basically take on the belief system in their culture. And really, I think this describes what happened to Leonard too, is that but some people think for themselves, and they go, well, I don't necessarily believe all this stuff. And there gets to be this reorganization in the mind, and people kind of basically flip out. And what we do is we stop them in the middle of that and drug them and never let them get through that process. And so there's a lot of people that really have learned how to help people through that. And one thing is just to have a safe environment for people to go through that and be supportive and non-judgmental. And one of my favorite things that Lauren Mosier said to me, well, actually he testified this in the Myers case. I asked him, of course I knew, do you have much experience with people experiencing psychosis and not being on drugs? And he said, oh my Lord, I've probably been with more unmedicated psychotics than anyone alive today. And then he said, and I find them among my most interesting customers. And so, I think that's kind of the attitude that one has to have, is that people go through stuff. It doesn't mean there's something wrong with them, and we just should, try and help them be safe. And a lot of time people are just terrified, and that's part of what's going on. And so it's really important to create an environment where people can feel safe. And so what we do now is exactly the wrong thing. I mean, police come in unannounced, break down doors. They virtually always get handcuffed to get taken in. And then, psychiatric hospitals are terrifying places. In the mental hospital, I mean, many people say that recovering from the trauma of what's happened to them in the mental health system was far harder to deal with than whatever brought them in the first place. After I jumped out the second floor window, I was hauled off to the loony bin in a straitjacket, and they, gave me drugs. Actually, they shot me up with something that put me down, and I remember waking up, and there was some kind of attendant with a clipboard when I woke up, and he asked me, what day is it? And I asked him, how long have I been asleep? And so he wrote down, not oriented to time, right? So that was a symptom. And they wanted to give me Mellaril, and I said, well, I don't want Thorazine. And they said, oh, Mellaril's nothing like Thorazine. Well, it's exactly like Thorazine. The same class, phenothiazine. But anyway, I was only on them for a month, and I was almost 30, which was actually lucky because I'd already really established myself. I had already gone through law school. I had a law practice, and so that was really helpful. But I had this idea that I had some kind of right to make decisions for myself. Foolish me, but I learned fairly quickly that if I was gonna get out, I better just do what they said. I mean, they had these ridiculous group therapy or whatever they called it, groups where the whole point was to denigrate people, you know, and they had the occupational therapy was making those hot pads, you know, like you used to weave when you were in kindergarten. That literally was what, you know, what their idea of occupational therapy. But I got out in about a month, and so I actually will still take something to sleep if I'm getting manic, and there's kind of this process. I've learned how to deal with it, but there's a process. If I don't get sleep, one of the first things that I do is I'll be witty and sharp and quick, and no one else will know it, but I can tell. And of course, it's not rocket science. If I don't sleep, I'm gonna, you know, go crazy. Okay, and that's true for most people. And I don't have a high tolerance for lack of sleep. Okay, so then at some point I'll get to the point where I think people are looking at me weird. Okay, well you could say that right now, right? So then, you know, that's kind of a sign that things, you know, that I'm kind of on the road. And so what I try and do first is tell myself, people probably aren't looking at me weird. Okay, and then I go, but if they are, it's probably because I'm doing something to make them look weird. So then I try and observe what I'm doing to make sure that I'm not doing anything that will cause people to want to grab me. And so if I'm at that point where I'm feeling pretty far along the road, I'll take something to sleep just to break that cycle. And the reason why it happens, it's always the same, is that, well, actually media events also are events that cause that. But basically, I'm a lawyer and I have deadlines, or I have a trial or something. And if there's a deadline and I'm not on top of it, I can't stop thinking about it. And so, you know, if you can't go to sleep. Okay, so one of the strategies that I use, which is pretty unusual for a lawyer, is that I will almost always do my filing the day before it's due. And it's unusual for lawyers because you can always make something better. You can always go over it again and make it better. But for me, it's like, well, I want to get it good enough, and I like to think my good enough is pretty good. I'll get it filed, and then I don't get into that problem. But if I do, I'll just take something to sleep, and almost always just for one night. And so, and even then, I'm pretty leery about it because they're actually pretty dangerous drugs. But, you know, you look at the risk-benefit and say, okay, should I take a pill to get sleep one night or risk, you know, being grabbed and locked up? So, I mean, it's been since 1985 since I've been in a hospital. I like what I do.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic.
Well, thank you for your time.
You bet.
Appreciate